The envelope sat on my desk for exactly 47 minutes before I opened it. White, corporate, sealed with the company logo I'd helped design 13 years ago when Mitchell Industries was still operating out of a renovated warehouse. My name typed in that impersonal font they used for official correspondence. Daniel Brooks, Senior Director of Operations. The title still felt too big for the kid from South Detroit who'd started in the mail room. My wife Lauren's sister, Victoria Mitchell, had taken over as CEO 6 months ago after their father retired. Old man Richard Mitchell had built this company from nothing, turning a small manufacturing operation into a $200 million enterprise. He'd been tough but fair, the kind of boss who remembered your kids' names and showed up at company barbecues with his sleeves rolled up, ready to flip burgers. Victoria was different. She'd spent 10 years at venture capital firms in New York, learning how to restructure companies and maximize shareholder value. When she walked into a room, you could practically see the spreadsheets running behind her eyes, calculating which employees were assets and which were liabilities. I knew what the envelope contained before I opened it. The signs had been there for weeks. Meetings I wasn't invited to anymore. Budget reviews where my department's numbers were scrutinized with surgical precision while others got nodded through. That particular smile Victoria gave me in the hallway, the one that didn't reach her eyes. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Formal, cold, efficient. We regret to inform you that your position is being eliminated as part of a corporate restructuring initiative. However, in recognition of your years of service, we're offering you the opportunity to resign voluntarily rather than face termination. This offer expires in 48 hours. The words blurred together as I read them twice, then 3 times. 13 years of 60-hour weeks. Of missing my son's baseball games to close deals. Of building systems that kept this company running. And this was how it ended. A piece of paper giving me 2 days to decide between resignation and termination. My desk phone rang. Victoria's assistant asking if I could come to the executive suite immediately. I looked at the envelope again, at the corporate seal that suddenly felt like a brand, and made my decision. When I walked into Victoria's office 10 minutes later, she wasn't alone. The company's CFO, Gregory Patterson, sat in one of the leather chairs, looking uncomfortable. Victoria stood by the window, backlit by afternoon sun, her posture radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been fired from anything in her life. "Daniel," Victoria said without turning around. "I assume you've read the letter." "I have." She finally turned to face me. "What's your decision?" I looked at Gregory, who was studying his hands like they held the secrets of the universe. He'd worked with me for 8 years. Knew every system I'd built, every crisis I'd navigated. We'd spent countless nights restructuring the supply chain, implementing new software, training staff. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes. "I'll resign," I said quietly. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Relief, maybe. Or triumph. "Smart choice. Gregory will handle the paperwork. We'll need your resignation letter by tomorrow morning. I'll have it on your desk by end of business today." That seemed to surprise her. "That fast?" "No point in dragging it out," I said. "When it's over, it's over." I left the office and walked back to my own, passing colleagues who'd worked under me for years. Sarah in accounting, who I'd promoted when everyone else said she was too young. Marcus in logistics, who I'd kept on staff when the board wanted to outsource his entire department. Jennifer in HR, who'd cried in my office when her mother died, grateful that I'd arranged for her to work remotely for 3 months. None of them knew yet that I was leaving. That tomorrow morning they'd wake up to an email announcing my departure and thanking me for my years of service in the blandest possible corporate language. But before you hear what happened next, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching this story unfold and you want to see how it ends, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me if you've ever been betrayed by family and business, and smash that like button, because this story is about to get interesting. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing something I should have done years ago. I documented everything. Every system I'd built. Every proprietary process I'd developed. Every relationship with suppliers and clients that ran through me personally rather than through official company channels. See, when you work somewhere for 13 years, especially when you start at the bottom and build your way up, you don't just learn the official systems. You learn the real systems. The actual ways things get done when the textbook processes don't work. I knew which suppliers would extend credit when cash flow got tight because I'd built personal relationships with their owners. I knew which clients needed hand-holding through implementation because I'd been the one holding their hands. I knew which software systems had undocumented workarounds because I'd created those workarounds when the official solutions failed. And I knew something else. Something I'd discovered 6 months ago during a routine audit that should have been straightforward but turned into something else entirely. The resignation letter I typed was exactly 1 sentence long. I, Daniel Brooks, hereby resign from my position as Senior Director of Operations at Mitchell Industries, effective upon full settlement of all outstanding compensation, benefits, and contractual obligations as outlined in my original employment agreement. Dated March 15, 2011. I printed it, signed it, and hand-delivered it to Victoria's office at 4:47 p.m. that same day. She glanced at it, then looked up at me with narrowed eyes. "This is pretty sparse, Daniel. You asked for a resignation letter. That's a resignation letter. Most people include some words about gratitude for the opportunity. Fond memories. Wishing the company well." "I'm not most people," I said. "And I'm not particularly grateful or fond right now." Victoria's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Fair enough. I'll have HR process this tomorrow. I noticed you kept it pretty formal with that effective date language." "Just being clear about terms," I said. "I learned a long time ago that clarity prevents misunderstandings." I left her office and walked out of Mitchell Industries at exactly 5 p.m., same as I had thousands of times before. Except this time, I was carrying a leather portfolio containing copies of 13 years of documentation, correspondence, and very interesting financial irregularities I'd stumbled across during that audit 6 months earlier. Lauren was in the kitchen when I got home, chopping vegetables for dinner. Our son Tyler was upstairs doing homework, his music bleeding through the ceiling. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a life that was about to become very abnormal. "I got fired today," I said, setting my briefcase on the counter. Lauren's knife stopped mid-chop. "What?" "Well, forced to resign. Your sister gave me 48 hours to quit or be terminated." She set down the knife and turned to face me fully, her expression unreadable. "Victoria fired you." "Technically, I resigned. But yeah, that's the gist." Lauren was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something play across her face. Shock, yes. But not surprise. Not the kind of outrage I might have expected from a wife whose sister just destroyed her husband's career. "What did you do?" she finally asked. The question hit me like a slap. What did I do? That's your first question. Not, why would Victoria do this? Not, how could she treat you this way after everything you've done for that company? Your first instinct is to assume I did something wrong. Well, she wouldn't just fire you for no reason, Daniel. You must have done something. I stared at my wife of 16 years, and suddenly a lot of things made sense. The way she'd been distant lately. Taking calls in other rooms. Spending more time at her sister's house. I'd attributed it to them getting closer since their father retired. Family bonding. How long have you known? I asked quietly. Known what? That Victoria was planning to push me out. Lauren's silence was answer enough. I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the door. Where are you going? Lauren called after me. To have a conversation with a lawyer who isn't going to ask me what I did wrong. I spent that night in a hotel room, surrounded by documents and a laptop, mapping out exactly how deep the rabbit hole went. The irregularities I'd found during that audit, the ones I'd been quietly investigating for months, weren't just accounting errors. They were systematic, deliberate, and very illegal. Victoria had been siphoning money from the company through a series of shell corporations. Nothing huge. Nothing that would trigger immediate red flags. Just a steady stream of $50,000 here, $75,000 there, disguised as consulting fees, vendor payments, software licenses for programs that didn't exist. Over 18 months, she'd moved approximately $3.2 million out of Mitchell Industries and into accounts she controlled. I had the paper trail. The bank records I'd managed to access through legitimate audit channels. And most importantly, I had the original employment contract I'd signed 13 years ago. That contract was a relic from the early days, when Richard Mitchell ran the company more like a family operation than a corporation. It contained language that wouldn't fly in modern employment agreements. Specifically, it outlined profit-sharing provisions, intellectual property clauses that gave me partial ownership of systems I'd developed, and a severance package tied to length of service that Victoria's HR department had conveniently forgotten existed. At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Brooks. A woman's voice. Professional and tense. This is Patricia Hammond from Hammond & Associates. I represent Mitchell Industries. I'm calling regarding your resignation letter. Good morning, Ms. Hammond. I need some clarification on the language you used. Specifically, what you mean by effective upon full settlement of outstanding compensation and obligations. Exactly what it says. My resignation becomes effective once Mitchell Industries has settled all outstanding amounts owed to me under my employment contract. There was a pause. The sound of papers shuffling. Mr. Brooks, I have your employment file here. Your contract outlines standard benefits and a 2-week severance package. That's not the contract I signed in 2011, I said calmly. That's a contract your HR department created last year during a company-wide policy update. I never signed it. My original contract, which is still legally binding, contains significantly different terms. Another pause. Longer this time. Can you send me a copy of this original contract? I'll send it to my attorney, and she can forward it to you through proper channels. You've retained an attorney? Of course. I'm a professional being forced out of a company I helped build. Why wouldn't I have legal representation? Patricia Hammond's voice took on a harder edge. Mr. Brooks, I should inform you that any attempt to leverage your departure for additional compensation could be viewed as what? I interrupted. Enforcing a legally binding contract, Ms. Hammond. I'm not leveraging anything. I'm simply ensuring that my departure is handled according to the terms I agreed to 13 years ago. If Mitchell Industries wants my resignation to take effect immediately, they need to settle what they owe me first. And what exactly do you believe they owe you? I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. I'll have my attorney send over a detailed breakdown. I think you'll find it interesting reading. I hung up and immediately called the lawyer I'd contacted the night before. Sharon Riverside was a specialist in employment law and had a reputation for destroying companies that tried to mistreat their employees. Sharon, I said when she answered, how would you like to take on Mitchell Industries? The breakdown Sharon sent to Patricia Hammond 3 days later was 47 pages long. It outlined every single obligation Mitchell Industries owed me under my original contract. And the numbers were staggering, even to me. First, there was the profit-sharing provision. Richard Mitchell had implemented it as a way to incentivize key employees during the company's growth phase. I was entitled to 0.5% of annual net profits for every year of service beyond 5 years. After 13 years, that was 4% of net profits, calculated retroactively for years when the provision hadn't been properly executed. Mitchell Industries' net profit last year was $18 million. 4% of that was $720,000. Second, there was the intellectual property clause. Any system or process I'd developed that became integral to company operations entitled me to licensing fees if the company continued using those systems after my departure. I developed or significantly modified 7 major operational systems. Sharon's valuation put the licensing fees at $2.5 million, payable as a lump sum or through ongoing royalty payments. Third, there was the severance package tied to length of service. 1 month's salary for every year worked, calculated at my current salary level. 13 months at $180,000 annually worked out to $195,000. Fourth, and this was where it got interesting, there was the non-compete clause. The standard language said I couldn't work for a direct competitor within a certain geographic area for 2 years after leaving. But the original contract had reciprocal language that Richard Mitchell had included because he believed in fairness. If the company enforced the non-compete, they had to compensate me for the restriction on my ability to earn income. Sharon calculated that compensation at $450,000, representing my potential lost earnings during the non-compete period. Total outstanding compensation, $3,865,000. Patricia Hammond called Sharon's office within an hour of receiving the breakdown. "This is absurd," Patricia said, not even bothering with pleasantries. "No court is going to enforce a contract with these kinds of provisions." Sharon's voice was ice cold. "Really? Because I'm looking at a signed contract, properly executed and notarized, that clearly outlines every provision we've cited. Unless you're suggesting the signature isn't your client's CEO's father. That contract is 13 years old. The company has changed. The contract hasn't been superseded by any agreement Mr. Brooks signed. He never agreed to new terms. Therefore, the original contract remains in force." There was a long pause. "This is extortion." "No," Sharon said calmly. "Extortion is forcing an employee to resign under threat of termination and then refusing to honor the contract he worked under for 13 years. What we're doing is contract enforcement. There's a difference. Mitchell Industries will never pay this. Then Mr. Brooks's resignation doesn't take effect, and he remains an employee of Mitchell Industries with full access to all the systems and information he had access to before, including his audit authority." Another pause, and I could practically hear Patricia Hammond's mind working. "What audit authority?" "Mr. Brooks holds a senior position with broad operational oversight. That includes access to financial systems for audit purposes. If he's still an employee, he retains that access. I'm sure your client would prefer not to have a disgruntled employee with audit authority remaining on the payroll indefinitely. This is blackmail." Sharon laughed. "Ms. Hammond, I'm going to give you some free legal advice. Look very carefully at Mitchell Industries' financial records for the past 18 months. Pay particular attention to vendor payments, consulting fees, and software licensing expenses. Then ask yourself if your client really wants Mr. Brooks maintaining his employee status and audit authority." The line went dead. I was sitting in Sharon's office when she hung up, and she turned to me with a satisfied smile. That got her attention. "You think Victoria will pay?" I asked. Sharon leaned back in her chair. "Victoria Mitchell is embezzling from her own company. She can't afford to have you running around with audit authority while this plays out. She's going to have to choose between paying you what the contract says you're owed, or risking you discovering more than you already have. What if she calls my bluff? What if she doesn't think I know about the embezzlement? Then we show her that you do. Carefully. With just enough detail to make it clear you have the full picture." Sharon crafted a letter that was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It didn't explicitly accuse Victoria of anything criminal, but it referenced specific transaction dates, vendor names, and dollar amounts that made it crystal clear I knew exactly what she'd been doing. The letter concluded with a simple statement: "Mr. Brooks believes these matters are best addressed through proper settlement of his contractual obligations, allowing both parties to part ways amicably and avoiding any need for further investigation or disclosure. Translation: pay me what you owe me, and I'll keep quiet about your felonies." The response came faster than I expected. 3 days later, Patricia Hammond called Sharon requesting an in-person meeting. We met in a conference room at Hammond's law firm downtown. Patricia was there with Victoria and Gregory Patterson. Sharon brought me in a paralegal who spent the entire meeting taking notes. Victoria looked smaller than I remembered. And there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Mr. Brooks," Patricia began, "we've reviewed your contract claims and your supporting documentation. While we dispute some of the valuations and calculations, we're prepared to discuss a settlement." Sharon didn't even open her folder. "What are you offering?" Patricia slid a single page across the table. $800,000, paid in installments over 2 years. In exchange, Mr. Brooks signs a comprehensive release, including non-disclosure agreements, non-compete enforcement, and an agreement not to pursue any further claims. I picked up the offer and made a show of reading it carefully. Then I set it down and looked directly at Victoria. "This is insulting," I said quietly. Victoria spoke for the first time since we'd entered the room. "Daniel, we're trying to be reasonable here." "Reasonable? You forced me out after 13 years, tried to deny me the benefits I earned, and now you're offering me a fraction of what my contract guarantees. That's not reasonable. That's insulting." "The contract provisions are excessive," Gregory said, finally finding his voice. They were written during a different era of the company. They were written when your company was honest, I said, letting some edge into my voice. When the person running it cared about more than just extracting maximum value before moving on to the next opportunity. Victoria's face flushed. You don't know anything about running a company, Daniel. You've never had to make the hard decisions. I know enough to spot fraud when I see it, I said quietly. The room went absolutely silent. Patricia recovered first. Mr. Brooks, I'm going to advise you to be very careful with accusations. Sharon placed a hand on my arm. A subtle signal to let her take over. My client isn't making accusations. He's stating that he has concerns about certain financial irregularities he discovered during routine audit procedures. Concerns that would need to be addressed before he could comfortably sign any release that prevents him from reporting potential corporate wrongdoing. Victoria's hands were shaking. You wouldn't dare. I leaned forward. Victoria, I spent 13 years building systems and relationships that kept this company running. I worked through weekends and holidays. I missed my kid growing up because I was here making sure everything worked. And you repaid that loyalty by forcing me out and trying to cheat me out of what I earned. So yeah, I would absolutely dare. Gregory looked at Victoria with something like panic. We need to settle this. Patricia pulled Victoria aside for a whispered conversation that lasted 5 minutes. When they returned to the table, Victoria looked defeated. $2.5 million, Patricia said. Paid as a lump sum within 30 days. Non-compete waived. Neutral reference guaranteed. But the NDA and release are non-negotiable. Sharon looked at me. I nodded. We want the full $3.8 million, Sharon said. Or we walk. That's not going to happen, Patricia said firmly. Then we'll see you in court, Sharon replied, standing up. And Mr. Brooks will continue as an employee with full audit authority until this is resolved. We were halfway to the door when Victoria spoke. Wait. We turned back. $3.5 million, she said quietly. That's as high as I can go without. She stopped herself, but we all knew what she was about to say. Without it being obvious, she was paying me off to keep quiet about the embezzlement. Sharon looked at me again. I thought about it, running the numbers in my head. $3.5 million wasn't the full contractual amount, but it was enough to make me whole and then some. And most importantly, it would let me walk away clean. Deal, I said. But I want it. In writing today, and I want the money in 14 days, not 30. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but Victoria just nodded. Done. The paperwork took 6 hours to finalize. By midnight, I had a signed settlement agreement guaranteeing me $3.5 million in exchange for my resignation, my silence about the financial irregularities, and a commitment not to sue Mitchell Industries for any employment-related claims. 2 weeks later, the wire transfer hit my account. $3.5 million. Minus Sharon's 30% contingency fee, that left me with $2.45 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months after I left Mitchell Industries, the company announced it was being investigated by the SEC for financial irregularities. Someone, it turned out, had sent an anonymous tip to federal regulators with detailed information about shell corporations and improper fund transfers. Victoria was arrested 6 weeks later. The investigation revealed she'd stolen nearly $5 million over 2 years, using increasingly sophisticated methods to hide the theft. She eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement and fraud. Last I heard, she was serving 8 years in federal prison. Richard Mitchell came out of retirement to stabilize the company. One of his first calls was to me. Daniel, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I heard what happened with Victoria. I'm sorry. I never should have handed the company to her without more oversight. It's not your fault, Mr. Mitchell. I also heard about the settlement. That was smart, protecting yourself with that contract language. I learned from the best, I said. You taught me to always get everything in writing. He laughed, but it was sad. I'm rebuilding the leadership team. I know you've probably moved on, but if you're interested in coming back. I appreciate that, I said. But I'm actually working on something new. My own consulting firm, helping companies build better operational systems. That's good, Daniel. That's really good. He paused. For what it's worth, you were one of the best employees I ever had. I'm sorry my daughter couldn't see that. As for Lauren, we separated 6 months after I left Mitchell Industries. The divorce was amicable, or as amicable as these things get. She'd known about Victoria's plan to force me out. Had even helped craft the strategy. That betrayal was something I couldn't get past. Tyler stayed with me most of the time. He was 14 now, old enough to understand what had happened and make his own choices about which parent he wanted to be around. My consulting firm took off faster than I expected. Turns out there's a huge market for someone who knows how to build operational systems that actually work. Within a year, I had 6 clients and was turning down work. Last week, I got a call from Gregory Patterson. He'd left Mitchell Industries and was working for a competitor. They were looking for someone to overhaul their operations department. Would you be interested? He asked. I know things ended badly at Mitchell, but... Gregory, I interrupted. Things didn't end badly. They ended exactly the way they needed to. And yes, I'm interested. Send me the details. Because that's the thing about getting forced out. Getting betrayed. Getting told you're not valuable enough to keep around. Sometimes it's not the ending of something. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something better. Victoria thought she was pushing me out to protect herself. To hide her crimes and remove someone who might discover what she was doing. Instead, she forced me to value myself properly. To understand what I was actually worth. And to stop settling for being undervalued. That one-sentence resignation letter, the one that seemed so simple when I typed it, turned out to be the smartest thing I ever wrote. Because it protected me. It forced them to face what they owed me. And it gave me the leverage I needed to walk away with my head held high and my bank account full. So if you're watching this and you're in a job where you're not valued, where you're being pushed out or forced to resign, remember this. Know your worth. Know your contracts. And never, ever let someone bully you into accepting less than you deserve. The resignation letter isn't the ending. It's just the beginning of getting what you're owed. This is where the story ends. How was today's story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and where you're watching from. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.